It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Josh comes from County Surrey, he tells me, so if you know anything about the United Kingdom, typically that's go to Waterloo Station in London, I think, and it's about an hour south, if I remember correctly. The Reverend Dr. Josh Moody is the senior pastor of College Church in Wheaton. He is known in a wide variety of roles, including pastor, author, conference speaker, and college campus speaker. He became a follower of Christ in the Church of England, was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, that's north of the city, where he was president of the Cambridge Inter-Collegiate Christian Union and later went on to complete his PhD there at Cambridge. He's married to his wife, Rochelle, and they have 4 children. He is the president and founder of God Centered Life Ministries, and he has written a number of books, including How the Bible Can Change Your Life and No Other Gospel. From 2007 to 2011, Dr. Moody served as Associate Fellow of Jonathan Edwards College at Yale University, and he's previously served Baptist churches not only in New Haven, but in Cambridge as well. He is here today because he has a passion for Christ and for the gospel. More than anything, he has a passion to see others follow Jesus Christ. Will you join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Josh Moody?
If you join me standing, we're going to look at the Bible together. And if you have a Bible, that'd be great. We're looking at one of the most well-known passages. I've been asked to address a question. Is Jesus the only way to God? It's one of the most important questions we have today. And it is also one of the most difficult to answer today. And really, that's going to be the whole theme of my time with you here on campus on Monday. And the passage we're looking at is John chapter 14. I'm going to start reading at verse from chapter 13 and verse 36. Here it is. Listen to God's word. Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the cock crows, you'll disown me 3 times. Then Jesus continues, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" Here's the key verse. Famously, Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And then he carries on, "If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." You can go ahead and grab your seats. Thank you so much. Really, it's good to be with you today. Thank you so much for your invitation. And it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much to Howard and Laurie for making it happen, and the chaplain for being here. I have a question for you. Do you really believe that Jesus is the only way to God? Is Jesus actually the only way to God? And if you do believe it, which I hope you do, or if you don't, I hope I can persuade you to do so this morning. Is it actually the case that most people today believe that Jesus is the only way to God? Or do they think he's one among a number of different gods? And there are all sorts of different realities out there. And yeah, it's okay to grow up as a Christian within the Christian tradition, but actually to accept that Jesus is the one and only God, that seems a little out there, a little harsh, frankly. Let me introduce it for you like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the troubles we face, the question we have, and the answer Jesus gives. And I'm going to introduce it with an illustration and then close it with a personal story of how it really helped me come to a conclusion that Jesus is truly the only way to God throughout the whole world, throughout the whole universe, in every place, every people group on the face of this planet. Here's the opening illustration. I don't know whether you like to watch Netflix. Oh yeah. Anyone like to watch Friends? Yeah, I love Friends. Anyone watch The Office? Yes. Okay, so in 2018, 32 million people watched Friends, and 52 million people watched The Office, so you know whose company you're in. I love Friends. I think in the way that we're talking about is Jesus the only way to God, we've moved in a sense from a Friends kind of thing to an Office kind of thing. Let me explain it to you. There's one famous episode in Friends when Ross is trying to drum up enough courage to ask Rachel out. And Joey says to Ross, actually, you can't ask her out. You're now in the friend zone, right? And I think for many people, it's almost like the idea that Jesus is the only way to God. I like Jesus, but I'm sort of in the friend zone. The idea that he's the only way to God, that he's the Lord God Almighty with all awesome power, that's a bit too much. I mean, it's okay for him to be a friend, sort of in the friend zone. I think a lot of people have been like that in the past, but I think much of our culture has moved out of the friend zone in their approach to Jesus being the only way to God. And so the analogy of The Office, there's a character in The Office called Angela Martin. And Angela Martin is, a little bit awkward in all sorts of ways. She likes cats. And she's a little kind of, she's always liking, she says at one point, I like to be judged. And she's an interesting character, but she's also a conservative Christian. And she's asked at one point, if you were stranded on a desert island, what would you like to take with you? What books would you like to take with you? She says, I'd like to take the Bible, 3 books you could take with you. The Bible and The Purpose-Driven Life. And she refused to give a third. Except she said, I'll take the Da Vinci Code just so I can burn it. And I think a lot of people in our culture today look at the idea of Jesus being the only way to God, not so much in the friend zone, but we kind of moved out of it to the scary zone. It's like if you're saying that Jesus is the only way to God, how many clicks away is that from saying that actually you're against other people who disagree with you on various moral issues and various cultural issues, and somehow you're bigoted or narrow-minded, and now you're not in the friend zone, you're in the scary zone. And it becomes harder and harder to actually accept the proposition that Jesus is the only way to God without somehow being labeled as a kind of Angela Martin conservative Christian who's out to judge other people. And that's a misunderstanding of what Jesus is saying in all sorts of ways. Let me explain why. Here it is, the troubles we have, the question we ask, and the answer Jesus gives. So first of all, the troubles we have. Here in this passage I just read out, where there's a lot of trouble that's going on. Peter is deeply troubled. They've just heard that Jesus is leaving, and that's an extraordinary troubling thing for them. This person they've been following with all their lives, and they've given everything to him, and now he's leaving, and they're deeply troubled. And Jesus says, don't be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. But the truth is that many of us these days, there are troubles that we face. We live in a world, we just celebrated 9/11 not that long ago, the anniversary, if you like, of 9/11, that terrible tragedy. We live in a world where that is hanging over us, where there's terrorism and fear. We live in a world where we've got this climate change going on, and people are saying to us, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Are we even going to have an environment that we can live in and thrive in for our children, our children's children? We live in that kind of world. We live in a world where there's increasing pressure on you, frankly, this generation. That what's going to happen in the future. We live in a world where there's the Great Recession. We live in a world where there's this cultural war where the president's about to be impeached, maybe, and who knows what's going to happen to that. And if you're British like me, you've got Brexit going on, which is deeply embarrassing for everyone. And you've got you live in a world where there's this extraordinary troubles that we face. And it's not just out there, it's in here. There's statistics on mental health are just off the charts. We live in a world where people are feeling increasingly anxious, increasingly depressed, increasingly uncertain about their future, increasingly like, what is going on? I have no idea. We're troubled. There are troubles that we face, and we want somewhere safe. We want a sanctuary where we can be safe. And then we hear this idea that Jesus is the only way to God. And we know if we grew up in a Christian home that, yeah, we should accept that. Yeah, we should believe that. We're in a chapel. Yeah, we should say, yeah, I believe that. But actually, do we? Really? Because if you say that Jesus is the only way to God, it sounds like you're almost saying, well, isn't that harsh? What about all those people who don't believe it? Are you really saying that they're actually all going to hell? I mean, how can you actually say that and be a nice, loving, kind, gracious kind of person? And then you've got all these troubles we face, all these confusion and dissonance and polarization and cultural conflict going on all the time, and then the mental space, the emotional space. We just want somewhere safe, and I think it's deeply troubling for many of us today. Look, I don't think I'm a wimp. I actually grew up playing a lot of rugby, which is, for those of you who don't know, is like football without pads. And I grew up playing a lot of rugby, and one time we were touring as a rugby team in Paris, in France, and the guy tackled me, and he dislocated my jaw, and I could feel it pop out, and then pop back in again. And then later that evening, they had a dinner for all the rugby players. They served steak, which was less than great if you just dislocated your jaw. And then later in the same tour, a guy kicked me in the head, and I had like a scar I got a scar down the middle of my face, which looks the forehead between the two eyebrows. Looks like I'm frowning, but really I'm not. It's just like a scar here. And my ear, I've got cauliflower ears. This ear, I can't really feel much in it. My kids think it's really weird, and you can kind of hang things off it, and it's in the shape of a cross, though one of my kids thinks it's in the shape of a ghost, which is less good if you're a preacher. A cross is a better way of describing it. And so I don't think I'm a wimp. I did mission work, and I did mission work in a country that had just come out of the Civil War. And when we were there as a team, we heard machine gun fire in the streets every night. Kalashnikov. That was the situation we lived in every single night when we lived there. I don't think I'm a wimp, but when I hear again of another shooting, when I hear again another race riot, when I hear again of another suicide, when I hear again of another deeply distressed conflict going on in a culture, and then I hear someone say, Jesus is the only way to God, I think, really? Really? Are you really going to shove that down my throat? Are you really going to say all these other people, it's just bye-bye, off you go to hell? It's like, really? I don't think so. That's the way I feel, because of the troubles we face. But then we have also the question that we have, and here we got Thomas. Thomas is kind of famous in the Bible for always asking the difficult questions. And Thomas is, sometimes called Doubting Thomas, but he asks the kind of question you and I want to ask. And basically what he says here is, how can we know the way to where you're going if we don't know where you're going? Which is a sort of nice, polite way of saying, what on earth are you talking about? How could that possibly be true? How can it be possibly true that you're the only way to God? And so we got questions, and I get those questions. I was introduced as Reverend Dr. Josh Moody sort of thing, and I did get educated. I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate. I got my master's there. I got my PhD there. Then I studied at Yale. I got a research fellowship there, and actually I was a fellow at Yale as well, Yale University, Jonathan Edwards College there at Yale for a while. So I got educated, and I know the questions that people have academically about the exclusivity of Christ, whether Jesus is the only way to God. And I tell you, you read Richard Dawkins and all the neo-atheists and the people who are attacking Christianity and say you can't really accept that Jesus is the only way to God. I understand where they're coming from. I've heard those arguments, and they're saying to us basically, get educated and you won't think that Jesus is the only way to God. And what I want to say is I got educated and I still do think Jesus is the only way to God. And here's why. I found that so often, when you listen to the arguments from the people who say, no, Christianity is just like this outmoded religion of a Middle Eastern prophet that you can no longer really accept, people who make those kind of arguments, when you listen to it, you find that they're cherry picking those arguments. They're actually not really engaging with the whole thing. And we'll be talking more about this afternoon, the colloquium. But here's one illustration of that, one example of that. My director of studies at Cambridge was a man called Don Cupid. And Don Cupid was an ordained Anglican clergyman, but unusually for an ordained Anglican clergyman, Don Cupid did not actually believe that God, in any traditional sense, that God really existed, but he was my director of studies at Cambridge, a good man, a kind man, very kind to me, but he did not believe that God existed. And I remember listening at the back of one of his lectures once, as he outlined in the most brilliant way, he's one of the most brilliant men I've ever met, as he outlined how, if you really follow the thinking of Western philosophy, and by the way, all philosophy in his thinking, if you really follow how human knowledge has developed through the ages, you can only come to the possible conclusion that God does not exist. If you really read Duns Scotus from the Middle Ages, if you really read up on the Renaissance with Guillaume Battista Vico in Italy and the other Renaissance thinkers, or Erasmus, if you really think about what happened to the Reformation with Luther and Calvin, all that, as they rediscovered learning, if you really think what happened to the Enlightenment with the French philosophers, Rousseau and all the Enlightenment movement that came out of Benjamin Franklin and all the rest in America, if you really think about that, if you really engage with Immanuel Kant with his philosophy, where he said there's no way you can actually know the real existence of God because there's a barrier to that. You can't know that. And then if you really engage with Nietzsche and his understanding of how Nietzsche's understanding of how, because of this, God is dead. And Nietzsche didn't mean that as a proposition of, I'm so pleased God is dead. Nietzsche was mourning the fact, he was sad the fact that Western philosophy had got to that moment where, of course, God is dead. And the only possible ethical challenge left was how to be moral when actually God is dead, which plainly failed. And as the European civilization, the 20th century, self-destructed and killed millions of people because he had no moral order left. And then he said, you just look at this and you come to the inevitable conclusion that there is no God. And of course, therefore, Jesus cannot possibly be the way to God because God does not exist at all. And that was his argument. And I listened at the back of this lecture as he went through all these different figures, all these, and he analyzed them, he summarized them so brilliantly, so poignantly, so poetically. And I listened to it in the back of the class feeling like I was 26 at the time, and he was probably, old like I am now, pretty old. And I was listening to him talk, and I thought, I'm really scared. My heart was going like this. I thought, I've just got to ask a question. So I put my hand up at the back of the classroom. I said, Dr. Cupid, your analysis has been absolutely brilliant, but why have you left out? Why haven't you even mentioned, like, Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff, two of the greatest philosophers alive today, who are Orthodox Christians? And I remember that moment as clear as day. He just had nothing to say. He just cherry-picked his argument. He just taken out of it to prove the premise that he'd already decided for probably other reasons that I don't know because I don't know him that well personally. All that to say, it's okay to have questions. I've got a lot of questions. Having questions is a good thing. I believe in the Socratic method that if you don't have questions, you're not going to have answers. Having questions is a good thing. But don't assume that if you've got questions, you're inevitably going to come to the conclusion that the idea that Jesus is the only way to God is intellectually moribund and nonsense. Don't assume that. There are ways of putting that together. The old ancient tradition, which I think is great in Latin, is credo ut intellegam, which means I believe that I might understand, or faith-seeking understanding. And what that means is that the comprehension of reality is necessarily shaped by a mind that has a trust component to it. And in many ways, the same thing was put together by one of the greatest philosophers of science in the 20th century, a man called Thomas Kuhn, in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He described how even in science moved by, in my words, a faith structure. In his words, a paradigm shift. Now, as you get the data, but you've got to summarize it somehow. You've got to trust it at some point. You put this paradigm together, and therefore you come to knowledge. And so, you may have questions. I have questions. But there are answers. So the troubles we feel, the question we have, and then the answer that Jesus gives. And so here Jesus is, this famous John 14 verse 6. It's a memory verse for many people. Jesus says there, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But often we finish reading it there. And what you really need to do is read it in context. The next verse, verse 7, what Jesus says there, he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In other words, what Jesus is saying, this is how I would summarize it. The reason why Jesus is the only way to God is because he is God. This to me has been like a lightning revolution is too strong, but a lightning clarity for me. The reason why Jesus is the only way to God is because he is God. In other words, it's not like there are all these different options here, all these different paths up the mountain. You know, you pick one, and the Christian tradition is kind of unkind in saying it's got to be this way, but I'm not going to accept all these others. No, he is the mountain. He is God. That's why he's the only way to God, because he is God. You know, I didn't used to argue this way. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, if you can believe this, I was a preacher then. I've been a preacher since, really quite young, and I was a preacher then. I actually got together all my non-Christian friends. I hired a room. I got together my non-Christian friends and asked them to listen to me, preach to them about why Jesus is the only way to God. And they came. And there they were. And I used this analogy, this story. I said, imagine there's a wall, it's a circular wall, and inside there's a garden, and you really want to get into that garden. And there's a door, and it's open. And I said, people who go around saying, Jesus is not the only way to God and I can't accept it, are a bit like people who walk around that wall wanting to get into that beautiful garden, that paradise. There's a door that's open, and they're walking around the wall, banging their head against the wall, saying, why isn't there another way? Why isn't there another way? Why isn't there another way? Like, there's a door. It's open. You can go in. It's not a bad way of explaining it, but it's not what Jesus says. Jesus says here, the reason why he's the only way to God is that he is God. In other words, look at it like this. Say, for whatever reason, you grew up knowing your mother, but you didn't know your father. You know he exists, but you don't know him. Maybe he left, maybe your mother left him. Doesn't matter. That's not important for the purpose of this way of explaining it. But say you don't know your father. You've never seen him. And here you are at university, and you go out for a coffee with a few friends, and you're sitting down in this coffee bar, and there you are chatting with some friends, and you're saying to, look, I just like to meet him. I just like to meet my father. I'd like to see what he's like. I'd like to know what parts of me are like him, what parts of me are not like him. The things I'd like to talk to my father about. I'd like to meet him. I'd like to find the way to meet my father. And you're talking like this, and your friends sort of commiserate with you, and then they go off to get another cup of coffee, and you're left on your table on your own, and there's another guy in the coffee shop who's been hearing what you've been saying. And he comes over to you, and he sits down, and he says, I hear you want to find the way to meet your father. And you say, yeah. And he looks at you and says, I am the way. He's the one you've been looking for. Jesus is the way to God because he is God. You want to find out what God looks like, you look at Jesus. You want to find out what's in the heart of God, you look at what Jesus does. You want to find out what displeases God, you look at what displeases Jesus. Jesus is God, therefore he is the way to God. God in his sovereign mercy has revealed himself through the Son of God. And his Spirit is with us now. And you can meet him. You can know him even today. Is Jesus the only way to God? The troubles we face? Yeah. We live in a world where people are like so discordant and the difficulties going on. The questions we have, we live in a world where there are these competing ideas that are thrown at us. It seems so hard to hold on to the idea that Jesus is the only way to God. The answer that Jesus gives, he is the way to God because he is God. Let me close with this. And this is how the penny dropped for me finally. I was traveling in a Muslim country. It's a Muslim country I worked in for a number of years. And I went to the airport, and for various reasons, the person who was meant to meet me at the airport didn't show up. And because they didn't show up, I was kind of stranded. I At that time, there was no way to change money, and there was no way to get into the city. The airport was on the outskirts. I was kind of stranded there at this airport in this Muslim capital city of a Muslim country. And then a guy sort of waved at me and said, "Hey, Josh." And it's like, "Oh, this is someone I met from a previous trip here." And I explained to him my situation. He said, "Come and stay with me." I said, "Well, fine, okay." So I went to stay with him. He was a student, and I stayed in his dorm. He was a Muslim student. And I stayed in his dorm room, and the next morning he got up early and did the thing that Muslims did. He knelt down and prayed and all this sort of thing. And I thought, well, I'm going to get up and just wander around. I wonder why God has me here in this dorm. It wasn't my plan. I wonder what God's plan is. And I started wandering up and down this dorm corridor, just knocking on doors and seeing what was going to happen. It's like, I must be here for a reason. So I was knocking on, "Lord, why do you want me here?" And I was knocking on doors, and most of them didn't answer. I knocked on one door. A guy opened the door. He looked at me, and he said, "Oh, yeah, come on in. Come and have some tea." And he explained that he was from Iran. The country wasn't Iran. It was another country, but there I was suddenly in an Iranian dorm with Iranian college students, sitting down on the floor, cross-legged with this Iranian student, having tea together. And we were just chatting. And he looked at me and said, "Are you an American?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm English." He said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Are you a Christian?" I said, "Actually, yes, I'm a Christian." He said, "Good. I've been praying that God would send me someone to tell me about Jesus." There's that one person God has listened to. And me not wanting to miss a subtle opportunity, shared Jesus with him. And many Iranians came to know Christ. Since that moment, I have never been able to believe that if someone calls out to God, God is not able to save them, and Jesus is the only way to God because he is God. It's been great being with you. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for being such a good audience and listening. And God be with you. God bless you. Go in peace.